The senator's daughter was dying on a marble floor, surrounded by the most powerful people in the country, and not one of them could save her. Her heart had stopped. Her lips were turning blue. The doctor standing over her was preparing the wrong treatment, and every second he wasted was a second she didn't have. But in the back of the room, a woman in a plain nurse's uniform was already moving. They'd spent the entire evening ignoring her, talking past her, treating her like furniture. What none of them knew, what she had hidden for 3 years, was that she had pulled soldiers back from death in places these people couldn't find on a map. And she was about to do it again. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where stories like this live, the kind that keep you up at night. Hit the like button if you want to see more, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The estate sat 3 miles outside the city limits of Harlow, South Carolina, perched on a ridge overlooking the Cooper Basin like it owned the horizon. Whitmore Ridge had been in Senator Garrison Whitmore's family for 4 generations, and on the 3rd Saturday of every October, it opened its iron gates to people who knew what it meant to be invited. The charity gala was black tie. The cause was veterans' mental health, which struck Maya Reeves as darkly appropriate the moment she pulled her Ford Escort into the staff parking area and saw the valets in pressed white jackets jogging toward the guests' vehicles. She sat for a moment after the engine cut out, her hand still on the wheel, and looked at the estate through the windshield. 3 years since she'd worn a uniform that meant something. 3 years since anyone had needed her for anything more complex than checking vitals and refilling IV bags on a rotation that started at 6 a.m. and ended when her feet stopped working. She grabbed her bag off the passenger seat and got out. The event company that hired her had been clear about the assignment: VIP medical support, background role. "You're there in case someone has too much champagne and feels dizzy," the coordinator had told her over the phone. "Nice dress under the scrubs. Look professional. Don't get in anyone's way." Maya had written down the address, confirmed the time, and said nothing else. She checked in at the staff entrance with a woman holding a clipboard and a headset, got her credentials badge and a rundown of the floor layout, and was shown to a small anteroom off the main ballroom that served as her station. There was a first aid kit on a folding table, a blood pressure cuff, a pulse oximeter, and a chair that creaked when she sat in it. The bar was 40 feet away. The bathroom was 60. The ballroom itself, through a set of propped-open double doors, glittered like something out of a magazine. Crystal chandeliers, white flower arrangements the size of small trees, waiters moving between guests with trays of champagne and oysters. The air smelled like money and floral arrangements and something faintly warm from the catering kitchen. Maya stood in the doorway and scanned the room the way she always scanned rooms now, even when there was nothing to look for. She didn't know where that habit came from anymore, whether it was training or 3 years of low-grade anxiety or something in between. She just knew she did it without deciding to. She clocked the exits, the crowd density, the way the room's noise bounced off the high ceiling and made it hard to hear anything below a certain pitch. She noted the locations of the servers, the security personnel positioned near the walls in dark suits, the small cluster of people near the stage where a string quartet was finishing a movement. She was looking for nothing in particular. She was looking at everything. "You're in the doorway." Maya turned. The man behind her was in his mid-50s, tall, with the kind of posture that got developed in medical school and hardened into arrogance somewhere around the 3rd promotion. His tuxedo fit perfectly. His silver hair was immaculate. He wore a name badge that read Dr. Raymond Briggs, Chief of Medicine, Harlow General Hospital, and he said it with his chin slightly elevated, the way people say things when they've gotten used to people stepping aside. "Sorry," Maya said, and stepped to the left. Briggs didn't move. He looked her over. The badge, the scrubs under her jacket, the bag. And his expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. The small recalibration people do when they decide something is beneath their attention. "Are you the medical support they brought in?" "Yes." "What's your background?" Maya met his eyes. "Critical care, emergency response." Briggs made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite dismissal, but lived comfortably in the space between both. "Well, hopefully the most exciting thing tonight is a sprained ankle from the dance floor." He looked back at the ballroom. "Stay near your station. If anything happens, you check vitals and you call me. That's the protocol." "Understood." He walked away without waiting for her to respond. Maya turned back to the ballroom. The crowd had thickened in the last few minutes. Senators and representatives circulated with donors and defense executives, and a scattering of military brass in full-dress uniform. She recognized Senator Whitmore from photographs, tall, white-haired, with a handshake that looked like it could crack something. He was working the room near the stage, laughing at something a man in a dark suit was saying, one hand on the man's shoulder. Next to the senator, standing slightly apart from the cluster of people around him, was a young woman in a floor-length green dress. Maya noticed her the way she noticed everything. Without meaning to, without knowing exactly what she was registering, her brain filing it somewhere below conscious thought. The woman was in her mid-20s, dark hair pulled up in a style that must have taken an hour, a champagne glass in her right hand that she hadn't touched. She was smiling at the right moments, nodding when someone spoke to her. But her eyes were doing something else. Maya watched for another few seconds and then went back to her station and sat in the chair that creaked. The first hour of the gala moved the way these events always did, slowly, then in bursts. Maya checked blood pressure twice for guests who came to her directly. One elderly man who'd forgotten his medication, and one woman with a tension headache she'd been nursing since the drive down from Colombia. Maya handled both in 10 minutes, sent them back with instructions, and returned to her station. She ate a small plate of food one of the servers brought her, drank water, and watched the room. Briggs came by once to verify she was still there, looked at her with the same slightly elevated chin, and left without speaking. At some point, a second physician joined the event. Younger, with the particular swagger of someone fresh enough to still be performing confidence. Maya didn't catch his name, but heard Briggs address him as Dr. Holt, and saw them shake hands with the ease of people who'd worked together long enough to know each other's rhythms. They stood near the ballroom entrance and talked. Neither of them glanced toward the medical anteroom. Maya watched the young woman in the green dress. She told herself she wasn't doing it. She had her eyes on the general crowd, checking the room the way she always checked rooms, and the young woman just kept appearing in her field of vision. That was all. But the third time Maya looked, she stopped telling herself anything and just looked. The woman had moved closer to the windows. She was still holding the untouched champagne glass. The smile was still operating, still landing at the right intervals when someone spoke to her, but something about the timing was off. A fraction of a second slow. Like a translation happening between what she was hearing and what her face was doing. She was pale, not the pale of good lighting and foundation, the kind that came from underneath. Maya set down her water glass and stood up. She didn't cross the room. She moved to the edge of the doorway and watched. The woman shifted her weight, and Maya caught a subtle but unmistakable compensation, pressure redistributed to avoid something. Not a twisted ankle, not new shoes, something internal. The woman's free hand came up briefly to her collarbone, fingers pressing lightly, then dropped back to her side. Maya was already calculating when the champagne glass began to tip. The woman didn't drop it. She set it down on the nearest surface, a deliberate movement, controlled. But her hand was shaking, and the glass rang against the marble edge of a decorative column like a struck bell. Two people nearby looked over. The woman tried to say something. Maya could see her lips moving. And then her knees went. It happened fast, but not instantly, and that was the difference. Maya had seen people faint from heat or nerves or alcohol, the way the body simply gives up standing and folds. This was different. This was the body trying to keep the fight going while the mechanism underneath it was failing. She was across the room before the woman hit the floor. There were other people closer. That was the reality of the situation. There were security guards 2 steps away, a server who reached for her arm and missed, half a dozen guests who spun around at the sound of the glass ringing. But Maya had been moving before any of them registered what they were seeing, and she was on the floor beside the woman in the green dress before the sound of the first alarmed voice reached her. "Olivia," Senator Whitmore's voice. Maya heard it cut through the room, sharp, and suddenly stripped of everything it had been carrying all evening. She pressed 2 fingers to the young woman's neck. The pulse was there, weak, erratic, and slow enough to be frightening. "Give her space," Maya said, and looked up. She was surrounded by a half-circle of faces, champagne glasses still in some hands, the room noise dropping by degrees as word spread that something was wrong. Senator Whitmore pushed through the cluster, and for a moment he looked at Maya the way everyone in the room looked at Maya, as an obstacle to be redirected while someone more qualified took over. His eyes moved past her toward the door where Briggs was already moving. "What happened? Is she—" "She needs quiet and space right now," Maya said. "Stand back, please." Briggs arrived at a pace that suggested urgency without quite achieving it, the pace of a man who was used to arriving to situations already in progress. He came down beside Maya and looked at Olivia Whitmore on the floor, then at Maya. "What do we have?" "Sudden loss of consciousness. Radial pulse is weak and irregular. She was compensating before she went down, protecting something in her chest." Maya kept her fingers at Olivia's neck and watched the young woman's face. "She hasn't been drinking. The glass was full." Briggs leaned in, checked the pulse himself. "Could be vasovagal? Dehydration? Heat? She's clammy. Look at the neck." He looked. Maya watched him look and saw the moment he registered the swelling in the jugular veins, then watched him pull back slightly from that knowledge instead of moving toward it. "Let's get her stable and wait for—" "There's no time to wait," Maya said. The sentence came out flat and certain, no performance in it, and something about that flatness made the people standing around them go quiet. Briggs turned to look at her. "I'll make the medical determinations here. Her neck veins are distended. Her pulse is weak and getting weaker. She's pale, and her skin is clammy without a high-heat environment to explain it." Maya kept her voice level. "She has cardiac tamponade. Blood is filling the pericardial sac and it's compressing her heart." The word landed in the room the way words do when no one is prepared for them. "That's a significant diagnosis for a—" Briggs started. "For someone who recognizes the presentation." Maya looked at him. "When did you last see it outside a textbook?" The silence between them had weight. Dr. Holt appeared at Briggs's shoulder. "The ambulance is on the way. Roads are—" He hesitated. "There's a storm. Lightning on Route 12 has an emergency vehicle rerouting. They're estimating 45 minutes. 45 minutes. Maya didn't say anything. She just went back to monitoring Olivia's pulse and doing the math that everyone else in the room was doing too, whether they wanted to or not. "She doesn't have 45 minutes, Maya said. "You don't know that," Briggs said, and his voice had a hard edge now. "You don't have the authority to diagnose, and you certainly don't have the authority to—" "Raymond!" Senator Whitmore's voice. Everyone turned. The senator was standing at the edge of the circle, and the expression on his face had moved through shock and arrived somewhere older and more dangerous. He looked at Briggs. "If this nurse is wrong, we deal with it. But you need to tell me right now if she could be right." Briggs's jaw tightened. He looked at Maya, at Olivia, back at the senator. "Tamponade is rare. The presentation could have other explanations." "Could," the senator said. "Could have other explanations." "Yes, but what happens if she's right and we wait 45 minutes? No one answered. The answer was in the room, in the shape of the silence. Maya was watching Olivia's face. The young woman's eyes had come open slightly. Not full consciousness, not awareness, but the body's last attempt to orient itself. Her lips were faintly blue at the corners. "The pressure on her heart is going to stop it completely," Maya said. "When that happens, standard CPR compresses the chest. In tamponade, chest compressions push more pressure against a heart that's already being crushed. It doesn't help. It accelerates the failure." She looked up at Briggs. Not at the senator, at Briggs. "If her heart stops and you start compressions, you will kill her in under 2 minutes." Briggs said nothing. His face was unreadable, the mask that physicians learn to put on when they're in a room that's watching them decide something. Dr. Holt crouched down beside them. He looked at Olivia, looked at the neck veins, looked at Maya. He said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly, to Briggs, "The presentation is consistent. Maya had the contents of Briggs's medical bag laid out on the floor in 90 seconds. The process was simple in concept and difficult in reality, which was a fair description of most things that mattered. Emergency pericardiocentesis. A needle inserted into the space between the heart and the sac surrounding it, drawing out the blood that was killing her. It required precision, and it required steadiness, and it required someone who had done it before, not in a controlled surgical setting, but in the dark, with inadequate equipment, and with no margin for a second attempt. Maya had done it twice, once in a forward operating base in a country she couldn't talk about, at night, with a headlamp and two other medics holding a soldier steady, once in a vehicle that was still moving. "You can't do this," Briggs said. "I know," Maya said. "Someone needs to." The senator looked at Briggs, and the senator's voice was very quiet. "Can you do it?" Briggs looked at the equipment on the floor. He looked at Olivia. He looked at Maya. And in the full sight of everyone in that room, the politicians, the donors, the defense executives, the military brass, Dr. Raymond Briggs, chief of medicine at Harlow General Hospital, said nothing. "Then let her." Senator Whitmore said it like a man who had made decisions under pressure before, who knew what it cost to make them, and who had decided to pay. He looked at Maya, and his voice was stripped completely bare. "Do what you can." Maya looked at Olivia Whitmore on the marble floor of the estate, 26 years old, her green dress spread around her, her lips going blue, her heartbeat doing something no heartbeat should do. "I need everyone back," Maya said. "I need quiet, and I need space, and I need someone to maintain light on this area." She looked at a security guard nearby. "You. Phone flashlight, pointed here. Don't move it." She looked at Holt. "If her heart stops, you tell me immediately. You don't touch her. You tell me." She didn't look at Briggs again. She gloved up, prepped the site, and got to work. The room was completely silent. Not the quiet of a crowd trying to be respectful. The quiet of people who had stopped breathing because the situation had demanded it of them, because something was happening in front of them that they didn't have language for, and the only appropriate response was to be still. The security guard held the light steady. Holt monitored the pulse with 2 fingers and his phone's stopwatch running. Senator Whitmore stood 3 feet away with his hands at his sides and looked at nothing in particular, which was the look of a man in free fall who has decided not to scream. Maya worked. She had blocked out most of the room by the time she was 90 seconds in. That wasn't a conscious decision. It was just something that happened when the work got to a certain level, the peripheral world going soft and the task in front of her getting hard-edged and close. She'd learned to trust that narrowing, back when narrowing was a survival tool. Now it was just what her hands did. The needle was in. She checked resistance, checked angle, adjusted by 2 millimeters that she felt more than measured. "Pulse is weakening," Holt said. Maya didn't answer. She withdrew slightly, redirected. "Still weakening?" "I know," she said. Dark fluid began entering the syringe. The change was not immediate. It didn't work the way movies suggested. No dramatic gasp, no instant resurrection. But at 43 seconds after the fluid began to drain, Holt said, "Wait." He said nothing else for 4 seconds. "Pulse is coming back." Maya kept her position, kept the angle, kept her hands completely still. The fluid continued to move. She was watching the rate, watching the color, doing the running arithmetic of how much, how fast, and what the delta meant. Olivia Whitmore made a sound. Not a word, not a gasp, just a low, rough noise from somewhere deep in her chest, the sound of a machine that had nearly stopped making a slow, grinding attempt to restart. Maya closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them and kept working. It was another 4 minutes before she was satisfied. Not certain. There was no certain in a situation like this, but the pulse Holt reported was stronger and steadying. Olivia's color was changing, the blue retreating from her lips, the waxy pallor shifting by degrees. Maya withdrew the needle, maintained pressure on the site, and looked up for the first time in what felt like much longer than it had been. The room was still silent. Senator Whitmore was looking at his daughter. Maya sat back on her heels, and the weight of the last several minutes settled into her muscles all at once. The particular exhaustion that came after, not during. She reached over and pressed 2 fingers to Olivia's neck. Pulse. Steady, present, of. She looked up at Holt. He was staring at her with an expression she hadn't seen on a physician's face in a long time. She was about to speak when she noticed something. She'd been gloved during the procedure, and the gloves were still on. And as she'd worked, something at the edge of her peripheral vision had been trying to get her attention without enough specificity for her to identify it. Now, with the immediate crisis at lower pitch, the thing came into focus. There was a small, dark object at the lower margin of where she'd been working, not inside the pericardial sac, adjacent to it, at the margin of the rib. Barely visible. Something that had no business being there. Maya looked at it for 2 seconds with the focused clarity of someone whose training had included learning to recognize things that weren't supposed to exist in the bodies of people who were supposed to have lived ordinary lives. She looked up at the security team, at the crowd, at the 140 people who filled the ballroom of the Whitmore Ridge estate, the politicians and donors and executives and military personnel who had spent the evening being powerful and important and credentialed and trusted. One of them had put it there. And whoever it was, they were still in this room. Maya didn't move. She stayed on her knees beside Olivia and kept her eyes moving across the room in a slow, methodical sweep, the kind that looked like nothing from the outside, the kind that was doing a great deal of work underneath. 140 people, give or take. The number wasn't exact. Events like this always had soft edges, people drifting in and out of the main ballroom, staff moving between the kitchen and the service corridors and the anteroom. But the core crowd was roughly there, gathered now in a loose horseshoe around the space where Olivia had gone down, the way crowds always gathered after something happened that they couldn't stop watching. She needed to not look like she was looking. She pulled off her gloves, balled them carefully, and set them in the kit bag while her eyes continued to move. Unhurried. No particular focus. Just a woman on her knees after a difficult procedure, coming back to herself. "Her pulse is stable?" she asked Holt, keeping her voice at the volume of a normal medical exchange. "Steady. Still on the low side, but steady." He had his stethoscope out now, pressed to Olivia's chest, doing what he should have done earlier. His voice had changed. The swagger was gone, replaced by something more careful and less certain, which was an improvement. "She needs a hospital." "Yes," Maya said. "She does." She stood slowly and stepped back from Olivia's immediate space, giving Holt room, giving Senator Whitmore room to move in closer to his daughter, which he did the moment he had it. She watched the senator kneel beside Olivia with the careful, deliberate movement of a man who was terrified of what touching her might confirm, and she saw the moment Olivia's eyes focused enough to find his face. "Dad?" The word came out wrecked and small and real. "I'm here." He put his hand over hers and stayed there. Maya turned slightly and looked at the object again. She didn't point, didn't gesture, didn't change her expression in any way that would register as significant to the peripheral vision of the 140 people whose peripheral vision was now directed at this space. The thing was small. Smaller than her thumbnail. Dark gray, slightly curved to follow the contour of the rib it was positioned against, which was what had made it nearly invisible during the procedure. It would have looked like a shadow to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for foreign objects at that margin, in that light, with that angle. It didn't look like anything that belonged in a human body. It didn't look like anything that had arrived there by accident. She needed to not touch it without documentation. She needed to not let the room see her reaction to it. And she needed to do both of those things while acting like her entire attention was still on the patient and not on the quiet, expanding certainty that Olivia Whitmore had not had a medical emergency. She'd been targeted. Maya straightened and looked for the senior security coordinator. She'd clocked him during her initial room sweep. Mid-40s, solid build, earpiece, stationed near the northeast entrance. He'd moved closer during the crisis and was now positioned about 12 feet away, watching the crowd with the focused attention of someone whose job had just changed shape without warning. She crossed to him at a walk that wasn't fast enough to signal urgency. "I need a quiet word," she said. He looked at her. "Ma'am, I'm monitoring the—" "I know what you're doing," Maya said. "This is related. 30 seconds. He studied her for a moment with the evaluating look of someone who had learned to separate actual emergencies from people who thought they were having them. Whatever he saw made him step slightly to the side, away from the nearest cluster of guests. "What is it?" "I need this room locked down," Maya said, quietly. "No announcements. Nothing that changes the room's behavior. I need your team at every exit, and I need it done in the next 4 minutes." His expression didn't change. "On what basis?" "On the basis that what just happened to that young woman was not a medical emergency." He looked at her for a long time. She let him look. "You're the nurse," he said. "Yes." "And you're telling me, I'm telling you that there is a foreign object in her body that did not arrive there through any natural process, and whoever put it there is currently in this room." She kept her voice absolutely flat. "You can ask me questions or you can secure the exits. Not both. Not right now." The coordinator looked past her at Olivia, at the senator, at Holt working, at Briggs, who had materialized somewhere in the last few minutes, and was now standing with his arms crossed at the edge of the crowd, with the particular posture of a man who wanted to appear to be in charge of something without getting close enough to it to be responsible. 4 minutes, the coordinator said. "Thank you." She turned back toward the patient. Briggs found her inside of 90 seconds. She'd expected it. In fact, she'd estimated about 2 minutes, so he was moving faster than she'd given him credit for, which meant he was more rattled than he looked. "What did you tell security?" he said. Quiet voice, close, not quite a whisper, but not intended to carry. "I told them what I found," Maya said. "What you found." He said it like the words tasted wrong. "You performed an unauthorized procedure on a United States Senator's daughter with equipment from my bag. She's alive. Without consent, without documentation, without a physician's authorization. She's alive, Dr. Briggs." Maya looked at him. "Would you like to continue, or would you like to know what I found?" His jaw worked. He was smart enough to know that the argument he was having was the wrong argument for the moment, and angry enough to keep having it anyway, which was a tension she recognized in people who were used to being the most credentialed person in any given situation and had just stopped being that. "What did you find?" he said. Not a question. The defeat in it was mostly buried. A foreign object embedded at the inferior margin of the fifth rib, adjacent to the pericardium, positioned and sized in a way that's consistent with deliberate placement. She watched his face. "It's not a medical device. It's not a surgical artifact from a prior procedure. I don't know exactly what it is, but I know it doesn't belong there, and I know it's not accidental." Briggs was silent for long enough that she could see him cycling through the options. Disbelief, dismissal, the particular reluctance of a person who wants to be wrong because being right means the situation is far more serious than they want it to be. I'm saying the ambulance needs to be met by federal agents and not just paramedics, and I'm saying this room needs to be sealed before whoever is responsible for that object realizes that Olivia is alive and adjusts their plans. She paused. "But those aren't medical decisions. Those are your calls to make, yours and the senator's and security's. I'm telling you what I found." He looked at Olivia. Something moved through his face fast that she didn't have a name for. "How certain are you, he asked. "I've seen what accidental foreign objects look like. I've seen what surgical artifacts look like. I've seen what deliberately placed objects look like." She didn't add anything to that, didn't explain where she'd acquired that particular frame of reference. He nodded once, short and tight. Then he walked toward the senator. Maya turned back to the room. The lockdown happened in the way that good security operations happened, invisibly, until it was done, and then suddenly and completely. She watched it roll out in the movement of suit jackets to exit points, in the quiet word passed to the event coordinator, in the way the noise of the room continued as it had been, while the shape of the room changed underneath it. Most of the guests didn't notice. That was the design. The ones who did notice were the ones paying close enough attention to sense that the parameters of the room had shifted, and of those, most assumed it was protocol related to Olivia's collapse. Understandable, a security response to a medical crisis, nothing more alarming than that. Maya watched for the ones who noticed and responded differently. She watched for the person whose attention moved to the exits at the moment the exits became secured. She watched for the one who made a phone call they hadn't been making before, or stopped making a call they had been making, or shifted their position in the room in a way that was looking for something without appearing to look. She was not trained as an investigator. She was trained as a combat medic, which was an adjacent skill in a combat environment, but not the same thing. So she watched with what she had: pattern recognition, threat assessment, the ability to read a space, and the people in it that had been drilled into her over years that she didn't talk about anymore. She was watching a cluster of guests near the east wall. 3 men in tuxedos, 2 women, The kind of loosely assembled group that had formed the way ballroom groups did, proximity and shared drift. When the door to the service corridor opened, it opened wrong. That was the only way she could describe it, and she knew it wasn't a rigorous observation. Doors opened and closed all evening. Staff moved in and out constantly. But this door had opened with a quality of quickness that was too deliberate for someone carrying a tray, and it had opened at an angle that kept the person's face away from the main room for a half-second longer than it needed to. The man who stepped through was in a dark suit, not a staff jacket. He was in his late 40s or early 50s, with the kind of build that came from deliberate maintenance rather than physical labor, and a face that was arranged very carefully into the expression of someone arriving from a side conversation and returning to the main event. He looked at the space near the windows where Olivia had been. He looked for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked at the exits. Maya moved. She didn't run. Running changed the room, and she needed the room to stay as it was. She moved at the pace of someone crossing to check on a patient, purposeful but not alarming. And she was angling toward the security coordinator rather than toward the man directly, which was the right order of operations and also the only way to do it without tipping what she'd seen. She reached the coordinator and said, low and direct, "Dark suit near the service corridor door, east side." He came from the corridor, not the main entrance. The coordinator looked past her, unhurried, the practiced non-look of someone who'd been trained to scan without seeming to. She watched his eyeline track and settle. "I see him." He checked the windows first, then the exits. A pause. "That could be. I know what it could be. I'm telling you what I saw." The coordinator pressed the button on his earpiece and spoke 3 words she didn't catch. Then he looked at her. "We'll observe." It was the right call, and she knew it. You didn't move on someone in a sealed room full of political figures based on a door opening and 3 seconds of eye movement. She returned to the medical space near Olivia and crouched down beside Holt, checking the pulse herself because she needed something to do with her hands. Steady. Still low, but steady. Olivia was drifting in and out, her eyes opening and closing at irregular intervals, which was concerning but not unexpected given what her cardiovascular system had just been through. "Ambulance?" Maya asked. "Revised ETA is 22 minutes, Holt said. "Storm is moving faster than projected." 22 minutes was workable. Olivia was stable, fragile, but stable. The tamponade had been partially relieved. The remaining pressure was something the hospital could address surgically. The immediate kill window had closed. Maya let herself acknowledge that for about 4 seconds. Then she went back to watching the room. The man in the dark suit had moved. He was 20 feet closer to the main group surrounding Olivia, and he was doing something with his right hand near his jacket pocket that could have been nothing and wasn't nothing, and Maya was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to stand. The senator was standing now 8 feet from his daughter, speaking in a low voice to Briggs. He had his back to the man in the dark suit. "Senator?" Maya said it at a volume that cut through the ambient noise without being loud, the pitch she'd learned to use when a room needed to respond without panicking. Whitmore turned. She looked at him, then past him, a movement of her eyes that was meant to direct his without being readable to anyone watching her face. The senator followed it. She saw the moment his gaze landed on the man in the dark suit, saw the recognition hit. Not alarmed recognition, familiar recognition. The look of a person seeing someone they know in a place where knowing them is suddenly complicated. "Marcus," the senator said. The man in the dark suit stopped moving. "I didn't know you were still here," Whitmore said. "I thought you'd left after the first hour." The man, Marcus, smiled in the way people smile when they need a second to decide what to say. "Garrison, I was just—" He gestured vaguely toward the corridor. "I had a call." "Of course." The senator's voice had changed in a register so subtle that most people in the room wouldn't have heard it. Maya heard it. "Come talk to me." It was a command dressed as an invitation, and Marcus heard it the same way Maya did. And the calculation that crossed his face in the 3 seconds it took him to respond was the most honest thing she'd seen from him. He came forward. The security coordinator materialized at Maya's left shoulder. "You called that," he said, very quiet. "I don't know yet if I called it right," she said. "Whitmore knows him?" "Apparently." The coordinator pressed his earpiece again, and Maya caught enough of what he said to understand that whoever was on the other end was going to be running a name. The ambulance arrived 19 minutes later, which was 3 minutes ahead of revised schedule, which meant either the storm had shifted or someone had applied pressure through a channel Maya wasn't aware of. She suspected the latter. The senator had been on his phone for a significant portion of the wait, speaking in the short, precise cadences of a man who knew how to convert political capital into operational results. The paramedics were efficient and professional and slightly overwhelmed by the situation they walked into. A ballroom full of political figures, a patient on the floor, 2 physicians and a nurse in a configuration that didn't immediately make sense, and a security team that had locked down every exit and was currently managing a situation that hadn't been explained to the paramedics yet and wouldn't be until they were outside the room. Maya walked them through the case in 60 seconds while they transferred Olivia to the gurney. Presentation, procedure, current status, what to watch for. She did it in the clipped, sequential format she'd learned to use in environments where 45 seconds was a long briefing. The lead paramedic, a heavy-set woman with gray at her temples who moved like someone who had done this particular job in the same city for 20 years, listened without interrupting, checked the site once, and nodded. "You did field pericardiocentesis," she said. "Yes." "With what?" "Briggs's emergency kit, 16 gauge and a 60 cc syringe." The paramedic looked at her for a moment. "Good call." It was not an effusive compliment. It wasn't intended to be. Coming from someone with that bearing and that resume, it was a complete sentence, and Maya registered it without letting it land anywhere visible. They took Olivia out. The senator went with her. The room, which had been held in suspension for the last 40 minutes, began to breathe differently. And then the man named Marcus Vale made his move. He did it well. Maya would give him that. He did it in the window between the ambulance departure and the room settling, the moment of maximum diffusion, when attention was scattered and people were beginning to talk to each other again, and the security team's focus was shifting to the logistical work of returning the room to something manageable. He drifted, not walked. He moved between clusters of people the way a current moves through a system, taking the path that generated the least resistance. And he was heading for the east exit that led to the estate's private parking with the unhurried confidence of a man who was simply leaving a party. He almost made it. The security coordinator stepped in front of him at the door. Maya watched from across the room. She couldn't hear the exchange, but she could read the shape of it. Marcus, still performing ease. The coordinator, professionally immovable. The beat of silence where Marcus assessed his options and found them reduced. What she didn't expect was the speed of what came next. Marcus turned, fast, the casual posture gone entirely, and in his right hand was something small and flat and dark. Not a weapon, a drive, a flash drive, being shoved into his jacket pocket as he moved. And he was not heading for the door anymore. He was heading for Maya. She understood why in the half-second before he reached her. She was the one who'd found the object. She was the one who'd documented, or would document, or could document, what she'd found inside Olivia Whitmore's body. He didn't know how much she knew, but he knew she knew enough, and she was currently the smallest and least credentialed person in the room, and people like Marcus Vale had spent their entire careers correctly assessing that people like Maya Reeves could be removed from situations without significant consequence. He was wrong about that, but she understood the logic. She had approximately 2 seconds. She used the first one to step out of the path he was expecting her to be in, moving left when his trajectory anticipated right, which put her beside him instead of in front of him. She used the second one on his arm. It wasn't graceful. Nothing about it was. She got his right forearm in both hands and used his own momentum to redirect it behind his back, and she did it with the mechanical efficiency of someone for whom this was not a remembered technique, but a physical vocabulary, something the body still spoke without needing to be reminded. Marcus Vale was larger than her, and he recovered quickly, and the next 15 seconds were not clean, and involved her being hit once with an elbow that she was going to feel for a week. But she had the arm, and she kept the arm, and by the time the security team reached them, Marcus Vale was on the floor of the Whitmore Ridge ballroom with his right arm still extended behind him, and the flash drive had skidded loose from his jacket pocket and come to rest against the base of a floral arrangement worth more than Maya's monthly rent. She was breathing hard. Her left side was going to be a problem tomorrow. She didn't let go of the arm. "I've got him," the coordinator said. She released and stepped back. The room was again completely silent. She looked up and found 140 faces looking at her. Politicians, donors, executives, military personnel, wait staff. Every single one of them looking at the woman in the plain nurse's uniform who was standing over a man twice her size, with her hair half out of its clip, and her left hand pressed to her ribs, and her breathing still ragged from the effort of the last 90 seconds. She straightened, pressed her hand flat against her side. The ribs were bruised, but nothing moved when she pressed, so probably not broken, probably, and she looked at the coordinator. "That drive," she said, nodding toward the floor. "Don't let it leave this room." The coordinator looked at her with something that was not quite the look people had given her earlier in the evening, the background employee look, the she's just a nurse look. Something in that look had recalibrated, not all the way but visibly. "No," he said. "It won't." Marcus Vale, face against the marble, said nothing. He was breathing. His eyes were open and directed at some point on the floor, and she could see him doing what people did when the situation had moved past the point where talking changed anything. Calculating, storing, waiting. She looked at his face for a moment. 49, 50 years old, expensive suit. The kind of face that had spent decades in rooms like this one, speaking the language of access and influence with the fluency of a native. She wondered how long he'd been in those rooms, and how long this had been planned, and what was on that drive. She stepped back from him and moved to the edge of the room, leaning against the wall, her hand still light against her ribs, and waited for the shape of the next hour to become clear. Somewhere outside, the storm that had delayed the ambulance was breaking, the leading edge of it reaching the estate in long, horizontal sweeps of rain against the tall windows, and the chandelier light caught each drop and threw it across the ceiling in moving patterns that had no interest in the situation below them. Her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She pulled it out. Unknown number, South Carolina area code, but not a number she recognized. She stared at it for 2 rings. Then she answered, "Miss Reeves?" The voice on the other end was male, middle-aged, with the flat, unadorned diction of someone in a federal agency who had long since stopped performing anything for anyone. "My name is Special Agent Dennis Rourke. I'm with the FBI's field office in Columbia. We've been briefed on the situation at Whitmore Ridge." A pause. "We have some questions about what you found inside Olivia Whitmore's body tonight." Maya looked across the room at Marcus Vale, still on the floor, still surrounded by security. "I expect you do," she said. "We're also going to need to talk about who you are," Rourke said, "because the background check we just ran on the name Maya Reeves came back almost entirely clean." She said nothing. "Almost," he said, "is the part I'd like to discuss." The rain had reached the windows in full force by the time Maya ended the call, long diagonal streaks cutting across the glass and distorting the light from the estate grounds into something blurred and unsteady. She stood with her phone in her hand for a moment. The ballroom had changed in the last 20 minutes. Not emptied, the lockdown was still in effect, but the quality of the crowd's energy had shifted from shocked and stationary to restless and beginning to ask questions. She could see it in the body language, the way people were turning to each other in the way they did when the initial adrenaline of a crisis started metabolizing into the need to understand what had happened and who was responsible for their current inconvenience. The coordinator, she still didn't have his name, and this struck her as an oversight she should correct, was managing Marcus Vale in the far corner, 2 other security personnel flanking, all of them keeping the posture of something ordinary while being very clearly not ordinary. Vale was standing now, not restrained, his hands loose at his sides in the way of someone who had decided that compliance was the correct tactical position for this particular moment. The flash drive was in a sealed evidence bag the coordinator had produced from somewhere on his person, which told Maya something about the quality of the security operation Whitmore ran. She crossed to the coordinator. "Rourke," she said. "FBI Columbia." He said they were briefed. The coordinator absorbed this without visible surprise. I know Rourke. He's solid. He looked at her. He told you they ran your background. Yes. And? Maya looked at him. And he wants to talk. That's not an answer. No, she agreed. It's not. He held her gaze for a moment with the expression of a man who had learned when not to push, then turned back to Vale. Maya walked to the medical station, sat down in the chair that still creaked, and began organizing what she knew into something linear. The object in Olivia Whitmore's body was small, curved, and positioned adjacent to the pericardium in a way that was anatomically precise. Not the work of someone who had read about the heart and made an approximation. The work of someone who understood cardiac anatomy at a technical level and had access to Olivia's body under circumstances that allowed placement without obvious trauma. No incision she'd seen, no bruising at the entry point. She had been sitting with the implications of that for 20 minutes, and the implications were significant and increasingly uncomfortable. It meant either a medical professional with specific knowledge and equipment, or something smaller and delivery mechanism assisted that she didn't have enough information to characterize. What she did know was that the object was not passive. It had done something. She didn't yet know precisely what, whether it was pressure-based or chemical or something else, but it had contributed to the tamponade. The blood surrounding Olivia's heart had been real, and it had been accumulating, and the object was in a position that was consistent with having caused or accelerated that accumulation. This was not something she could hand off to Rourke cleanly over the phone. This required showing him, or showing someone who could get to Olivia before the hospital's surgical team removed and potentially discarded what they found inside her. Maya was already reaching for her phone again when Briggs appeared. He didn't come in sideways this time, didn't lead with the professional posture and the elevated chin. He came in straight, and he sat down in the empty chair across from her, and he looked like a man who had spent the last 20 minutes doing the same kind of internal accounting she had. "The object," he said. "You described it to security." "Yes." "And to the FBI, apparently." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain shifted direction, and the window light changed. "What kind of object?" he asked. "Specifically." Maya looked at him. This was a different question than the ones he'd been asking earlier, and it was coming from a different place, not the territorial physician protecting his professional perimeter. Something else. "Why?" she asked. "Because if it's what I think it might be," he said, "we have a problem that is significantly larger than what happened in this room tonight." She studied him. He was not performing anything. The careful professional composure was mostly down, and underneath it was a tired man in his mid-50s who was looking at her like someone who needed to know the truth and understood he was not in a position to demand it. "What do you think it might be?" she said. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and said a word she hadn't expected. She went very still. "You know what that is," she said. It wasn't a question. "I was a military medical advisor before Harlow General," Briggs said. "Consulting only. I was never operational. But I sat in enough rooms with people who were." He stopped, started again. "Where it was discussed." "Discussed. As a concept, a delivery mechanism. The kind of thing that gets funded and then gets classified and then gets attributed to a contractor when the attribution becomes unavoidable." He sat back. His hands were not steady. "I didn't think it had been deployed. I was told it hadn't been deployed." "Someone told you incorrectly?" Maya said. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment. It was the most human thing she'd seen him do all evening. "The senator's investigation," he said. "He's been investigating defense contract irregularities for 14 months. There were rumors about what he'd found, who'd be implicated." He dropped his hands. "Olivia works in his office. She has clearance." Maya was already there. Had been there since the flash drive hit the floor. "She was carrying evidence," Maya said. "Is that a guess?" "It's where everything points." Briggs was quiet. Then, "What do we need to do?" She didn't thank him for the pronoun shift. She just answered the question. "We need to get word to whoever is receiving Olivia at the hospital that the object needs to be preserved and documented before any procedure. And we need Rourke here faster than he's currently planning to arrive. I can call the receiving surgeon at Harlow General directly." He was already reaching for his phone. "And the senator can do more with the FBI's timeline than I can." "Yes," Maya said. "Get him. Out shout." Briggs made 2 calls in 8 minutes, and both of them moved things. The receiving surgical team at Harlow General was put on notice by a cardiac surgeon named Dr. Adiez Fowler, who had apparently trained under Briggs a decade ago and trusted him enough not to require a full explanation at midnight during a storm. The senator, brought back into the conversation by the coordinator, called someone in Washington whose name Maya didn't catch and whose title she suspected was several layers above special agent, and Rourke's revised ETA went from 90 minutes to 40. Maya spent the intervening time doing what she was trained to do, reassessing, rechecking, and looking for what she'd missed. She hadn't gotten a good enough look at the object. That was the core problem. She'd seen enough to know it was there and enough to know it was wrong, but she hadn't had the time or the light or the position to characterize it with any precision. And the characterization mattered because, whatever Briggs believed it was, she needed independent grounds for the same conclusion. She went back to the space near the windows where Olivia had been. The marble floor was marked now. The equipment she'd used, the impressions of knees and shoes, the small things that accident scenes left behind. The event staff had been kept away from it on the coordinator's orders. Good. She crouched down and looked at the floor. There was a small dark smear on the marble to the left of where Olivia's upper body had been positioned. Not blood. Wrong color. Wrong viscosity. Something else. She photographed it with her phone, 3 angles, trying to keep the flash from blowing out the detail. Then she stood and looked at the space and tried to work backward. Olivia had been standing near the windows. She'd been pale, compensating, protecting something in her chest. She'd set the glass down and gone to her knees before losing consciousness completely, which meant she'd had some warning, felt something change, felt the pressure building, tried to get to a safe position before the lights went out. That meant onset had been gradual enough to allow a response, not sudden, like a rupture, a slow accumulation, which meant the object had been active for some period before Olivia collapsed. Hours, possibly. She'd been in the room from the start of the gala, and she'd been managing something the entire time. The smile that was half a second slow, the hand at the collarbone, the untouched champagne. She'd known something was wrong with her body well before the crisis point. She'd been fighting it. Maya felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. Olivia had spent the last hours of what she probably believed might be her life standing next to her father in a room full of the people responsible for what was happening to her. And she'd kept smiling. Maya stood with that for a moment. Then she went back to work. So, Rourke arrived at 37 minutes, not 40, which told her something about how seriously he was taking the situation or how seriously Washington was taking it, or both. He was younger than his voice, early 40s, lean, with the kind of economy of movement that came from doing a physically demanding job for a long time. He came through the main entrance with 2 other agents, and the coordinator met him at the door. Maya watched the handshake. Brief, functional. 2 people who had dealt with each other before and had calibrated assessments. Rourke found her within 4 minutes of entering the room. That was also informative. Ms. Reeves. He didn't extend his hand, which she read not as hostility, but as someone who got to the point. Walk me through what you found. She walked him through it. She was precise, and she was sequential, and she did not editorialize, because Rourke had the eyes of someone who formed his own conclusions and trusted that process, and didn't particularly benefit from someone else's interpretive layer on top of raw information. She gave him the raw information. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, you performed the pericardiocentesis. Yes. Without authorization. Without a physician willing to do it, Maya said, which is a different thing. He looked at her with the flat, assessing gaze that she suspected he used for most of his conversations, and that most people found uncomfortable. She didn't find it uncomfortable. She found it honest. Your background, he said. Maya Reeves. Clean record. Nursing license in good standing. No flags. Previous to 3 years ago, the record gets thin. Yes. Thin, and then a gap, and then before the gap, a different name in some records that got, not deleted, but managed. He said the word with a precision that told her he understood what it meant and how it happened, which tells me that whoever managed it was operating with resources above a certain level. She said nothing. I'm not asking you to confirm your service history. Rourke said. "I don't need you to, but I do need to know, so the object you found. You've seen things like it before?" The question landed with the specific weight of someone who had spent 37 minutes getting to this room and had spent those 37 minutes thinking about what to ask when they got here. Maya looked at him for a moment. The ballroom was still full, though quieter now, the energy of the crowd having cycled through its phases and arrived somewhere flat and waiting. Briggs was on the far side of the room, still on the phone with the hospital. The coordinator had Marcus Vale in a position near the north wall that looked casual and was not. "I need to be careful about what I say here," Maya said. "I know," Rourke said. "Take your time." She took exactly as much time as she needed, which was not very much. "The general category of what I saw: delivery mechanism, cardiac adjacent placement, designed to present as natural pathology. I've read documentation. I haven't seen deployment. I was told deployment hadn't happened." Rourke nodded slowly. Dr. Briggs said something similar. "Briggs was in different rooms than I was," Maya said. "The documentation I read was more specific." The agent went quiet. He was looking at the floor between them, not seeing it, running something through an internal process that she wasn't party to. Then, "The flash drive. The coordinator has it. I need it." "I know." She walked him to the coordinator, effected the transfer of the evidence bag, and stepped back. The coordinator gave it with the appropriate documentation: the agent who'd sealed it, the time, the chain of custody from the point of recovery. Clean, professional. The coordinator ran a tight operation. Rourke held the bag and looked at it. "Whatever's on this was worth killing a 26-year-old for," he said, not to anyone in particular. "Yes, I am," Maya said, "and someone in this room put the mechanism in her body." He looked up at the crowd. "Someone who had access to her, medical access." "That's the conclusion I keep arriving at," Maya said. Rourke turned and looked at Marcus Vale across the room. Then he looked back at Maya. "He couldn't have done it himself." "No," she agreed. "He couldn't." "So there are two people," Rourke said. "He's one. We need the other." The process of identifying the second person took 40 minutes and went in a direction Maya hadn't predicted, which she accepted as a consequence of not being an investigator and not having all of the information. Rourke's team moved through the room systematically, which was the right approach, and also the slow approach. And while they moved, Maya stayed near the medical station and kept herself available and visible and tried not to be in the way. She was not entirely successful at the last part. The thing she kept returning to was the placement, the precision of it. Whoever had put the mechanism in Olivia's body had done it in a way that left no obvious external evidence. No bruising, no visible entry point, nothing that a general physician at a gala medical station would find in a cursory examination, which meant either an extremely skilled, minimally invasive approach or access to Olivia in a medical context, in a procedure room with equipment. She thought about the guest list: politicians, donors, defense executives, military, and physicians. Several physicians, including those attending in a professional capacity. She thought about Briggs. She didn't want to think about Briggs, but she thought about him anyway, because the discipline of actually looking required looking at everything, including the things you didn't want to look at. Briggs, who had arrived at the scene and hesitated. Briggs, who had brought his medical bag. Briggs, who had been told from a distance about the object, and who had responded with specific knowledge about what it might be. Knowledge that required having read documentation about something classified. She was building a case she didn't want to be building, and she knew it, and she kept building it anyway, because the alternative was stopping when it got uncomfortable, and she had stopped doing that a long time ago. She went and found Rourke. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to understand that I'm not making an accusation. I'm giving you a thread." He turned from the agent he'd been speaking to. "I'm listening," she told him. She was careful and she was fair, and she presented it the way she would want it presented if someone were presenting it about her, as a series of observations that raised questions rather than a conclusion that demanded action. She told him about Briggs's hesitation over the procedure, his knowledge of the classified category, his arrival at her station afterward, and the specific, detailed nature of his disclosure. Rourke listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, You know this could be explained by exactly what he told you. Prior advisory role, relevant classified exposure. Yes, Maya said. I know. But you're telling me anyway. Yes. He nodded. Okay. He looked across the room at Briggs, still on his phone. I'll run it. Maya went back to the station. She sat down, and the chair creaked, and she pressed her hand against her left side where the ribs were complaining steadily now. The kind of ache that was going to keep her awake regardless of what else happened tonight. She was trying to decide if she'd just done the right thing or the wrong thing when her phone buzzed again. Same unknown number, she answered. Ms. Reeves, Rourke's voice, but from the phone, not from across the room. She looked up. He was still in the same position, but he had his own phone to his ear and he was not looking at her. I need you to stay calm, and I need you to listen to what I'm about to tell you. Her hand tightened on the phone. We've been running the guest list against medical licenses and defense contractor affiliations. One name came back with a flag we weren't expecting. He paused for exactly as long as the pause needed to be. The object you found. The classification on the program that produced it. The contract was held by a company called Arvast Solutions. Private defense, dissolved 18 months ago after a federal investigation that didn't result in charges. She was very still. The VP of Medical Operations at Arvast Solutions, Rourke said, was Dr. Raymond Briggs. Not an advisory role, not consulting. He ran their medical division for 4 years before coming to Harlow General. The room continued to make its noise around her. The chandelier light moved in the rain patterns on the ceiling. 40 feet away, Briggs was still on his phone, and as Maya watched, he looked up and found her across the room. The expression on his face was the one she'd been looking at all evening and misreading. It wasn't the expression of a man who was rattled and slowly becoming cooperative. It was the expression of a man who had been watching her from the moment she walked into this room, waiting to understand exactly how much she knew. He called the hospital, Maya said, quietly, so only Rourke on the phone could hear. He called the surgical team. He told them. I know, Rourke said. I'm looking at his phone records right now. He didn't call Harlow General's main line. He called a direct number that routes to a secondary technician on the OR floor. A pause. We're trying to reach the receiving surgeon. Ms. Reeves, we're having trouble reaching the receiving surgeon. Maya was already standing, already moving, already heading for the coordinator because the coordinator was the one with the operational authority in this room, and she was about to need it. Briggs saw her move. She watched his phone come down from his ear. She watched him calculate. She watched him start to move too. The distance between them was the length of a ballroom, 40 feet of marble and crystal light, and 140 people who were between them and in the way. And she was running the geometry in her head even as she was crossing the room, and Rourke was saying something in her ear that she couldn't process because the calculation required everything she had. Briggs was closer to the east exit than she was. He was closer to the exit than the coordinator was. If he moved for it now, in the next 10 seconds, before the security team understood what was happening, she stopped calculating and raised her voice. Not a scream, not a warning. The voice she'd used in forward operating bases when a situation required immediate action from multiple people who didn't have time to be briefed. Door east now. The coordinator's head came up. His eyes went to the exit. He was already moving. Briggs reached the door at the same time the coordinator's team reached Briggs. And what happened in the next 8 seconds was loud and fast, and not controlled in the way that security operations were supposed to be controlled. And when it resolved, Briggs was against the wall beside the east exit, with his arms secured and his phone on the floor, and his face expressing the specific, cold fury of someone who had been 3 seconds from something and had not gotten there. Maya crossed the room and stopped 6 feet from him. He looked at her. She looked at him. The drive, she said. That's not all there is it? He said nothing. The mechanism in Olivia's body. There were protocols, activation, escalation, things that required someone with access to the program's documentation to initiate or to stop. She watched his face. You've been on the phone this entire time, not with the hospital, with whoever is on the other end of the escalation protocol. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A small, cold confirmation. If Olivia dies on that table, Briggs said very quietly, It resolves the problem. The evidence dies with her. There's nothing left to investigate and no one left to testify. He looked at her with something that was almost clinical. You should have stayed in your station, Nurse Reeves. She kept her face still. Where is Dr. Fowler? She said to the coordinator, to Rourke in her ear, to anyone who could act on the answer faster than she could. Rourke's voice came back. OR3. She's in the procedure. We can't reach her directly. Patch through the OR's internal line. We're trying. The hospital switchboard is... Get someone in the building, Maya said. A person, in the building, at the door of OR3. Now. She looked at Briggs. Who else is in that OR? She said. Who else did you call? He looked back at her with the face of a man who had decided he was done cooperating with the direction of the evening, and said nothing, and the silence was its own answer, complete and cold, and loud enough to fill the ballroom. Her phone was already dialing. She had Harlow General's main switchboard number from the briefing materials she'd been given at check-in 8 hours ago for a gala that was supposed to be champagne and sprained ankles. The line rang 4 times. Then a voice answered, and Maya began talking, and somewhere across the city, in OR3, Olivia Whitmore was on a surgical table with something in her body that had been designed to kill her, and there was a person in that room who had been put there to make sure the job got finished. The switchboard operator had the flat, efficient voice of someone pulling a night shift at a hospital during a storm, fielding calls from people who needed things done immediately and would not accept alternatives. Harlow General Medical Center, how can I direct OR3, Maya said. I need you to physically send someone to the door of OR3 right now. Not a page, not an intercom, a person at the door. Ma'am, I can't interrupt an active surgical. There is a person in that operating room who is not supposed to be there and who intends to harm the patient. She kept her voice completely level because a level voice got compliance faster than urgency, which was something she'd learned the hard way in situations where compliance was the difference between a good outcome and a catastrophic one. I am working with FBI Special Agent Dennis Rourke out of the Columbia Field Office, who is currently attempting to reach you through official channels. I need 30 seconds of someone's time at that door. That's all. A pause. Keys clicking. Hold, please. She held. Across the room, Briggs was being managed by 2 of the coordinator's people. His phone, evidence-bagged, and his expression locked into something that was past fury and into the controlled vacancy of someone running calculations about what came next. Rourke had moved toward the east exit, phone still up, coordinating something on his end with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had handled situations that accelerated past their expected parameters before. The hold music was a generic instrumental that lasted 42 seconds. Maya counted. Then a different voice, male, slightly out of breath, the edge of exertion in it that suggested someone had crossed a significant distance quickly. This is the OR charge nurse. Who is this? My name is Maya Reeves. I'm a nurse. I performed emergency pericardiocentesis on your incoming patient, Olivia Whitmore, at Whitmore Ridge Estate approximately 55 minutes ago. Dr. Fowler's team is receiving her. I need you to listen to me for 60 seconds, and then I need you to act. A beat. Go ahead. The patient has a foreign object embedded near the inferior 5th rib, adjacent to the pericardial margin. It needs to be documented and preserved before removal. Photographed in situ, chain of custody established, not discarded as surgical debris. That object is evidence in an active federal investigation. She paused for exactly the time it took him to absorb that. And you need to confirm who is currently in that OR. Everyone in that room. Name and role. A longer pause. She heard movement on his end, the background sounds of a hospital at work. Ventilation, equipment, the particular acoustic signature of a place that ran continuously. Dr. Fowler is surgical lead, he said slowly. Anesthesiology is Dr. Park. Scrub tech is Brianna Walcott. Circulator is... He stopped. Maya waited. We have a late addition, he said. Dr. Garrett Sims. He came in 20 minutes ago. Said Dr. Briggs had called ahead, authorized him as an observer on the case. She was already talking before he finished the sentence. Get Dr. Fowler's attention. You don't have to stop the procedure, but you need her aware that the observer in her OR was placed there by a man who is currently in FBI custody, and his presence in that room is not authorized. She kept her voice level and clear and moved through the sentence without pausing in places that would let him start asking questions she didn't have time to answer. Do it now. Do it quietly. And do not let Sims near the patient or the instrument table. The sound on the other end changed. She heard him moving, heard a door, heard the subtle environmental shift of someone entering a space that required a different kind of quiet. She lowered the phone and looked at Rourke. He was watching her from across the room with the expression of someone who had just heard half of a conversation and was filling in the other half. Sims, she said. Garrett Sims. He's in the OR. Rourke was already on his radio. What happened in OR3 over the next 11 minutes was reconstructed for Maya later, in pieces, from people who had been present for different parts of it, and even assembled, it was not a clean narrative. Clean narratives were for after, when there was time to arrange events into something that made sense from a distance. What she understood, in the order she understood it, was this. The OR charge nurse, his name was Terrence Obie, and Maya would remember it, had gone into that operating room and positioned himself between Garrett Sims and the instrument table without explaining why, which required a certain kind of nerve, and which Obie apparently had in sufficient supply. Sims had noticed and started asking questions, and Dr. Adaiz Fowler, who had been briefed in the operational shorthand of someone managing two things simultaneously, had responded by calling a brief instrument pause that halted the procedure long enough for two Harlow General Security officers to appear at the OR door. Sims had not gone quietly. That was the part that came through most clearly regardless of who was telling it. He'd argued, then escalated, and in the escalation had said something about authorization and about Dr. Briggs's specific instructions that had been heard by everyone in the room and that everyone in the room would be asked to repeat to investigators over the next 72 hours. By the time the federal agents that Rourke had dispatched reached the hospital, Sims was in a security office on the second floor with two witnesses to his statements and a phone that had been taken from him before he could clear the call log. The procedure resumed. Dr. Fowler completed it. Olivia Whitmore came through surgery at 1:47 in the morning. Maya heard that part while she was sitting in a chair at the estate's staff entrance, which was where she'd ended up sometime around 1 a.m., when the ballroom had started to feel too small and she'd needed air and had found that what passed for air tonight was 50-degree rain and a covered doorway and the parking lot lights turning the wet asphalt into something that looked like a painting. Rourke came and found her there. She's out, he said. Maya nodded. Fowler said the object was documented, photographed, measured, extracted with full chain of custody. He sat down on the concrete step beside her, which was the kind of thing she hadn't expected from him and which recalibrated something. Whatever it is, our forensic team is going to spend a long time with it. Good. Sims is cooperating faster than we usually get cooperation, which means he's scared, which means there's something above him that he's more scared of than us. Briggs, Maya said. Briggs and above Briggs. Rourke looked out at the parking lot. The drive. We got a preliminary on the drive. She waited. 14 months of documented payments. Defense contract overruns that were deliberate, inflated by a factor of 3 to 4 times actual costs. The excess routed through a series of holding companies that eventually led back to 7 individuals. Senator Whitmore's investigation had identified 5 of them. He paused. The other 2 are significantly more senior. One of them is a current member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. The rain had eased to something lighter, less insistent. Maya listened to it hit the parking lot. Olivia had been building the supplemental documentation, Rourke said. The 5 her father had already identified. She had the evidence chain that would make charges viable. Without her and without that drive, the investigation would have collapsed. Too circumstantial, too much room for the defense to operate in. That's why she was the target, Maya said. Yes, not the senator. The senator is protected, too visible, too watched. Anything that happened to him would trigger the kind of scrutiny that ends careers and starts grand juries immediately. But his daughter, working in his office, carrying research materials, He stopped. It could have been presented as cardiac arrest, a young woman with an undiagnosed structural anomaly. It happens. People would have been sad. The investigation would have been reassigned to staff who didn't have her understanding of the material, and within 8 months it would have been quietly deprioritized. Maya thought about Olivia standing in the ballroom for 3 hours with the thing in her body, managing the symptoms, keeping the smile operational, standing next to her father, who didn't know, in a room full of people who were responsible for it. She knew, Maya said. Didn't she? Rourke was quiet for a moment. We think she suspected something was wrong. Whether she understood what it was, he shook his head. We'll know more when she can talk. They sat with that for a moment. Your background, Rourke said, not aggressively, just placing it in the space between them and leaving it there. You already know the shape of it, Maya said. I know the shape. I don't know the details, and the details are classified above my clearance level, which tells me enough. He looked at her. Someone buried your service record well enough that a standard federal background check returns almost nothing. That takes resources and intent. Yes. The same people who buried it are the ones who discharged you. She didn't answer. He hadn't asked a question. The discharge, he said. Unauthorized procedure, battlefield conditions, soldiers at risk. You acted outside your authorized scope. That's what the record says. Is that what happened? Maya looked at the parking lot. There was a van from a news station at the far end, a camera operator leaning against the side of it, waiting for something to photograph. Someone had called the press, or the press had their own sources, or both. It didn't matter. What happened, she said, was that I was the only person present with the knowledge to keep 3 soldiers alive during an extraction that went wrong, and I kept them alive. And when we got back, the officer who had given the order to proceed without adequate support needed someone to absorb the failure of that decision. She said it the way she'd rehearsed saying it in her head for 3 years, flat and sequential, and it still felt like pressing on something that hadn't finished healing. He had the rank. I had the record. Rourke nodded. It was a nod that didn't require elaboration. The soldiers you saved, he said. 3 of them. They're alive. Yes. Did they? They submitted statements, Maya said. It didn't matter. The officer's account was the one that went into the record. Rourke was quiet for long enough that she glanced at him. He was looking at his hands. I'm going to need your full statement about tonight, he said. Everything. Documented. And I need you to understand that what you did in that ballroom is going to be very difficult to contain, which means people are going to know your name. I know, Maya said. After 3 years of not knowing your name. Yes, he looked at her. How do you feel about that? It was a more human question than she'd expected from him, and she took a moment with it. I haven't decided yet, she said. The sun came up on a situation that had expanded considerably from the shape it had been in at midnight. By 4 a.m., there were 3 federal vehicles parked at Whitmore Ridge, a forensic team working the ballroom, and a legal representative for Marcus Vale, who had arrived from somewhere and was currently not achieving much in a conversation with 2 federal agents in the estate's library. Vale himself had been transported. Briggs had been transported. Sims was already cooperating in a federal building in Columbia, working through the call log on his phone with 2 agents who would spend the next several days following each number. Maya had given her statement to Rourke and one of his agents in the anteroom where she'd started the evening, at the table with the blood pressure cuff and the pulse oximeter and the chair that creaked. She had been thorough, and she had been precise, and it had taken 2.5 hours, and at the end of it she was more tired than she'd been at any point in the previous several years, including years that had been objectively harder than tonight. She drove back to her apartment in Harlow as the sky went gray and then pale, and then the particular washed-out yellow of an early morning after a storm. The streets were wet and quiet, and she drove carefully because her ribs were complaining whenever she turned the wheel, and her concentration was at about 60% of where it would normally be. She parked, climbed the stairs to her 3rd-floor apartment, and sat on the edge of her bed with her jacket still on. She sat there for a while. Then she lay down without taking the jacket off and was asleep before she'd decided to be chutzed. She woke up at 11:17 to 4 missed calls, 2 of them from numbers she didn't recognize. One from her shift supervisor at Harlow Regional, where she worked her regular rotation, and one from Rourke. She called Rourke first. Sims gave us Briggs, Rourke said without preamble. Full cooperation, looking for a deal. Briggs was the architect of the placement. He'd been Olivia's physician 4 years ago, routine physical when she was interning in Charleston. He retained her records. When Arvas needed a mechanism to neutralize the investigation, he was the one who knew her history, knew her anatomy, and had the technical knowledge from his time running Arvast's medical division to direct Sims in the procedure. A pause. Sims is a surgical fellow. He was recruited by Briggs 2 years ago. The placement happened 6 weeks ago during a routine cardiology follow-up that Briggs had orchestrated a referral for. Maya absorbed this. 6 weeks. Olivia had been carrying this for 6 weeks. The activation, she said, timing mechanism, linked to a proximity trigger on her phone, Vale's device specifically. When Olivia came within a certain range, it initiated a cascade. The gala was the chosen event because the senator would be present, because Vale would be present, and because a medical emergency at a crowded event would be managed by the available personnel before a hospital could respond. Another pause. The available personnel being a VIP nurse with no notable qualifications. Briggs arranged my assignment, Maya said. We believe so. The event company that hired you, we're looking at who made the staffing request. She'd been moved into position. She'd been the intended audience for a death, and she'd been chosen specifically because she was not supposed to be able to prevent it. He didn't know your background, Rourke said. No one did. That was the part of the plan that failed. She looked at the ceiling of her apartment. There was a water stain near the window she'd been meaning to report to the building manager for 4 months. Vale, she said. Charged this morning. Conspiracy to commit murder, federal charges relating to the defense contract fraud, a separate charge relating to the flash drive, and his attempt to recover it. His attorney is arguing diminished involvement, but the call logs don't support that. Rourke's voice had the particular dryness of someone who found the attorney's argument technically interesting and substantively absurd. He's looking at significant time. The 2 senior names on the drive. Rourke's pause was longer this time. That's moving through different channels. I can tell you that warrants are in process. Someone on the Armed Services Committee, Maya said. I can't confirm that conversation for another 48 hours, which was confirmation enough. She understood the shape of the language. Senator Whitmore, she said. He's been briefed. He was at the hospital this morning with his daughter. Rourke cleared his throat, which was the first unguarded sound she'd heard from him. He asked about you, specifically. Wanted to know how to reach you. Maya said nothing. I told him I'd pass along the message, Rourke said. He can wait until you're ready. That's my professional opinion. Thank you. One more thing. His voice shifted slightly. Not softer, but less procedural. The discharge. Your record. I've made some calls that aren't part of the official case file. She went still. I'm not in a position to make promises, he said, but I've spoken with people who are in a position to look at what was documented versus what occurred. The officer in question retired 14 months ago. His version of events is the only one in the official record, but it's not the only one that exists, and given that 3 people who were present for the incident are alive to provide testimony, he stopped. I'm saying someone is going to ask those 3 soldiers some questions. The sound that came out of Maya surprised her. Not a cry, not anything like that. More like the sound of something under sustained pressure finally finding a small release. Involuntary, brief, and then done. Okay, she said. Get some rest, Rourke said. We're going to need you available for the next several weeks. She ended the call and sat up and went to the window. The street below had dried mostly from the morning sun, just the gutters still running. Ordinary midday. People walking, a delivery van double parked, the Vietnamese restaurant on the corner with its lunch sign out. She'd lived in this apartment for 2 years, and she knew the street well enough that ordinary felt ordinary, which was a thing she hadn't been able to say about most places she'd lived. She thought about calling her shift supervisor back. She thought about the 2 unknown numbers, press probably, or Rourke's office, or both. She thought about Senator Whitmore at the hospital this morning, sitting with his daughter who had spent 6 weeks carrying a weapon designed to kill her and managing the smile, and standing in rooms full of the people who'd put it there. She thought about what Rourke had said. Someone is going to ask those 3 soldiers some questions. She'd spent 3 years not thinking about the soldiers because thinking about them meant thinking about what had been taken from her for saving them. And she didn't have a clean way to hold both of those things, the gratitude and the loss in the same frame, without one canceling the other. Maybe that was something she'd have to learn. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She looked at it, thought about the water stain on the ceiling and the delivery van outside and the lunch sign at the Vietnamese restaurant and the 48 hours of statements and official proceedings that were ahead of her. She answered, "Ms. Reeves." Not Rourke. Older voice, measured, with the particular quality of someone who had spent decades in rooms where words were chosen carefully because the wrong one had consequences. "My name is Garrison Whitmore. I'm calling because my daughter is awake, and the first thing she asked me, the very first thing, before she asked for water, before she asked about the surgery, was whether the nurse who saved her life was all right." Maya sat down on the edge of the bed again. "She's asking for you," the senator said, "if you're willing." Something shifted in her chest. Not the ribs, not the bruising, something deeper and less easily named. "I'll come," she said. She arrived at Harlow General at 2 in the afternoon, through the main entrance, past the front desk staff who didn't know who she was, through the elevator to the 4th-floor cardiac recovery ward, and down a corridor that had the particular smell of all hospital corridors, antiseptic and recycled air, and something beneath both of those that was harder to name. The senator was in the hallway outside the room. He was taller in person than he appeared in photographs, or maybe he just seemed larger because he was standing with the specific, deliberate attention of a man who had been preparing for this conversation and wanted to do it right. He extended his hand. She took it. "Thank you," was what he said, and the 2 words came out carrying more weight than most full sentences she'd heard in her life. The kind of weight that comes from meaning the thing completely rather than from volume or elaboration. "She was alive," Maya said. "I kept her that way." "You kept her that way against every obstacle this room could produce," Whitmore said. He held her gaze with the directness of someone who had been in politics long enough to know what it looked like when someone was performing and what it looked like when they were not. "I know about your service history. Agent Rourke briefed me this morning." "Which parts?" "Enough." He let it settle. "I owe you an apology on behalf of the institution that—" "You don't," Maya said. "That's not yours to carry." He accepted that with a nod that was more than just acknowledgement. "She wants to meet you," he said, and gestured to the door. Olivia Whitmore was propped up in the hospital bed with the careful positioning of someone managing post-surgical discomfort that she was not going to admit to. She was pale in the way of anyone 20 hours out from cardiac surgery, with the particular quality of exhaustion that went past physical into something that takes longer to recover from. But her eyes were clear and present, and they found Maya immediately when she came through the door. "You're the one who found it," Olivia said. Her voice was rougher than it would normally be. "The intubation, the anesthesia, the hours of surgery." "Yes," Maya said. "He told me—" She glanced at her father, standing near the window. "He told me that you were the only nurse on duty, that the doctors wouldn't act." "That's approximately right." Olivia looked at her. She looked at Maya with the specific, careful attention of someone who was deciding something, not about the situation, but about the person. Taking measure. "I knew something was wrong," she said. "For weeks. I had tests, all clear. My regular cardiologist kept saying it was stress, anxiety, recommended I take a break from the office." She stopped. "His name was in my father's files, on the payment records. I didn't make the connection until last week." "Dr. Briggs," Maya said. "He referred me to a colleague for a follow-up echo 6 weeks ago. I thought—" She exhaled. "I thought he was being thorough." She looked at her hands on the blanket. "I found the file connecting him to Arvast 4 days ago. I added it to the drive. I didn't know then what I know now, that the follow-up appointment was how they—" She stopped again. "You don't have to—" "I want to." Olivia looked up. I want to say it out loud so it's real and so I understand what happened to me and so I can. Her jaw tightened. I can decide what to do with it. Maya understood that, precisely. The evidence on the drive, Maya said. Rourke said it's viable. It's more than viable. For a moment, something crossed Olivia's face that was less the expression of someone in a hospital bed and more the expression of someone who had spent 14 months building something they believed in. The payment records alone established the fraud. The supplemental documentation I added traces 3 of the primary beneficiaries through financial instruments that they tried very hard to obscure. She paused. They killed for this. They tried to kill me for this. That means it works. Senator Whitmore made a sound near the window that wasn't quite a word. Maya looked at Olivia and thought, 3 years in a station with a blood pressure cuff and a chair that creaked, waiting for the world to need something she could give it. And here was someone who had spent 14 months building a case that people had tried to bury her for, and she was talking about it from a hospital bed 20 hours out of surgery with the clear, undefeated focus of someone who had decided to be defined by what they built rather than what was done to them. She understood that too. There's something I need to tell you, Olivia said. Her voice had dropped slightly. About tonight, about the gala. Maya waited. The event company that assigned you to the gala. I've been thinking about that since I woke up this morning. Olivia looked at her with the focused, careful look again. I know that company. My office has used them for events. The contact there, the one who manages VIP staffing assignments. His name is in the supplemental documentation I added to the drive. The room went very still. His name is there, Olivia said, because he's the coordinator for one of the shell companies that receive payments from Arvas Solutions. Maya heard it and felt it arrange itself into the shape it had been all along, the shape she hadn't fully seen until this moment. Briggs had known who she was when she walked in. That was what she'd misread in his face, not the face of a man watching her from a distance and recalibrating, the face of a man who already knew her history and had chosen her specifically because 3 years ago someone had buried it, and buried people stayed buried, and a nurse with a redacted record performing an unauthorized procedure on a dead senator's daughter would be the most convenient possible outcome. They hadn't counted on her succeeding. They'd counted on her trying and failing, and in the failure becoming the explanation. The story was supposed to be a disgraced former medic, unqualified, attempting a procedure beyond her scope, causes the patient's death at a gala. The investigation into the senator's evidence dies with his daughter. The nurse becomes the cautionary tale that closes the file. She sat with that for a long moment. Does Rourke know? She said. I called his office an hour ago, Olivia said. He's pulling the staffing records. Maya looked at the window behind Senator Whitmore, at the afternoon light coming through it, ordinary and indifferent and present. She'd been placed in that room not as a resource, as a liability with a pulse, waiting to be activated. And somewhere in the network of people who had built this particular architecture, there was still at least one person Rourke hadn't reached yet. The person who had approved the staffing request, who had made the specific call to use Maya Reeves, who had looked at a buried service record and seen a tool rather than a woman. That person was still unaccounted for, and they would know by now that everything had gone wrong. Rourke called at 4:17 that afternoon, while Maya was still in the hospital, sitting in a chair in the 4th floor family lounge with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. The staffing coordinator, he said. Name is Patrick Sell. 43, based in Colombia, runs the event company's VIP division. We pulled his financials this morning as part of the broader sweep and found the shell company connection Olivia flagged. A pause that had texture to it. We went to his office at 2 p.m. He wasn't there. His assistant said he left at noon, said he had a client meeting, hasn't been reachable since. Maya set the coffee cup on the table beside her. He knows. We're operating on that assumption. His car was found at the Columbia Amtrak station at 3:40. He didn't buy a ticket under his name, which means he either bought under another name or he left the car there as misdirection and is still in the city. Rourke paused. Either way, he's running. Which means he's scared enough to run, but not prepared enough to disappear cleanly, Maya said. That's our read too. We have his picture at every transit point. His passport was flagged at 2:15. He's not leaving the country. Another pause. I wanted you to know the status. Appreciate it. There's one more thing, Rourke said. The two senior names on the drive. I told you 48 hours. It's been less than that, but the situation moved. He cleared his throat. Senator Aldous Prine of the Armed Services Committee was contacted by federal investigators at 10 this morning at his home in Georgetown. He declined to comment and contacted legal representation. A warrant for his financial records was executed at noon. The pause this time was longer. The second name is a former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense named Gordon Hart. He retired 3 years ago. He is currently cooperating with investigators, which his attorney describes as voluntary. We describe it as a man looking at what's on that drive and understanding his options. Maya said nothing for a moment. The family lounge had 2 other people in it. An older man reading something on his phone, a teenage girl asleep across 2 chairs with her jacket pulled over her. Ordinary waiting. The kind that happened in hospitals, all day, every kind of life arriving and sitting in these chairs and staring at these walls. Prine, she said. Yes. He's on the Armed Services Committee. He chairs the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, Rourke said, has for 6 years. 6 years of sitting in the exact position to approve the contracts, direct the funds, and protect the people doing both. 6 years of Arvast Solutions billing the federal government at 3 and 4 times actual cost, and a portion of that excess arriving, through enough layers to be survivable, in places that benefited Aldous Prine. The senator's investigation would have exposed him, Maya said. Would have and will, Rourke said. The drive doesn't just establish the fraud. Olivia's supplemental documentation traces Prine specifically through 2 holding companies. It's the kind of evidence trail that closes cases. He said it with the particular satisfaction of a man who had spent a career building cases and knew the difference between the kind that held and the kind that collapsed. She built it carefully. She knew what she was doing, Maya said. She did. He let that sit for a moment. Get some rest if you can. You're going to need to be available for the next phase of interviews, but that starts tomorrow. Tonight you're off the clock. Rourke, she said before he could end the call. Yeah. Sell. When you find him, and I think you will, because the ones who aren't prepared to disappear don't disappear. I want to know. You'll know, he said, and ended the call. She stayed in the lounge for another 20 minutes, drinking the cold coffee because she'd already committed to it, watching the afternoon light move across the linoleum floor. Then she went back down the hall to Olivia's room, knocked on the open door, and found the senator gone and Olivia awake and looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone doing private arithmetic. She sleeping? Maya asked. Trying to. Olivia turned her head. Not particularly succeeding. Maya came in and sat in the chair by the window. She didn't try to fill the silence, which was the right instinct. Olivia was the kind of person who could operate in silence. You could tell that from how she'd managed the ballroom, managing the symptoms and the crowd and her father's proximity for 3 hours, which required a certain internal organization that didn't need to be constantly reassured by noise. Prine, Olivia said after a while. You know about him? I put his name on the drive. I know who he is. She paused. I've met him at my father's events, at committee things when I was interning. He has a way of looking at people who work in offices rather than sit in chairs that is very specific, like you're part of the furniture. Like what you know and what you've done is interesting only to the extent that it's useful to him. Maya understood that kind of looking intimately. He's going to try to negotiate, Olivia said. His lawyer is going to work angles, and he's going to make statements about context and cooperation and the complexity of defense contracting, and he's going to try to turn 14 months of documented fraud into a misunderstanding that can be managed. She said it without heat, which was more unsettling than anger would have been. The clarity of someone who had looked directly at something ugly and decided to understand it rather than flinch from it. But the documentation doesn't have context. The payments were what they were. The shell companies are what they are. The math is what it is. Yes, Maya said. My father spent 14 months being told he was wrong, that the numbers were explainable, that the contractors were legitimate, that the investigation was politically motivated. She looked at the ceiling again. He kept going anyway. Not because he was certain. He told me once that he wasn't certain, that there were weeks when he thought he'd built it wrong, that he'd followed a thread that led nowhere. She paused. But he kept going because the alternative was deciding that something he knew was wrong was actually fine, and he couldn't make himself do that. Maya sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, the afternoon was shifting toward early evening, the light going amber and long. He's not the only one who kept going, Maya said. Olivia turned her head and looked at her. After a beat, neither are you. It was a simple sentence, and it landed with the weight of something that had been thought about, not said reflexively. Maya received it the way she'd learned to receive things that were true and uncomfortable, without deflecting and without making a bigger deal of it than it was. Get some sleep, Maya said. The next few weeks are going to require you functional. Olivia almost smiled. Is that a medical opinion? It's a practical one. She left the room and walked down the corridor and took the elevator down and went home. Patrick's cell was found 2 days later. He hadn't left Columbia. Rourke's red had been right. The car at the Amtrak station was misdirection. The move of someone who'd seen enough crime procedurals to know what running was supposed to look like, but not enough actual experience to execute it with the details that mattered. He'd been staying at a motel 11 miles from his office under a name that was his mother's maiden name combined with his middle name, which was the kind of password construction logic that worked for email accounts and not for federal fugitive situations. Rourke called Maya when they had him. He gave up prying immediately, Rourke said, before his attorney had finished sitting down. Full statement, documented, including 2 phone calls he'd had directly with Prine's office in the 72 hours before the gala. Prine knew about the mechanism, Maya said. Prine approved it. Cell has the messages. Encrypted, but our forensic team has the keys from Vale's device, and the encryption was the same protocol across the network. He paused. It's done, Maya. It was the first time he'd used her first name. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it. Prine's attorney is now in conversation with the DOJ about cooperation terms, Rourke continued, which tells you what the attorney believes the evidence looks like. Hart confirmed Prine's role in his own statement, which he gave voluntarily and at length because Hart is 71 years old and has apparently decided that the version of this story where he dies having been cooperative is preferable to the alternative. And Briggs, she said. Federal charges filed this morning: conspiracy to commit murder, unlicensed use of classified medical technology, obstruction. Sims is charged separately as a cooperating defendant. The deal his attorney negotiated requires full testimony against Briggs, which Sims provided. Another pause. Vale's trial date is set. His attorney stopped arguing diminished involvement after the call logs from Prine's office were entered into evidence. She was in her apartment, sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd eaten every meal for 2 years alone with the television on because the silence was too much when she was too tired to fight it. The afternoon light came through the window and fell across the table, and she sat in it and listened to Rourke lay out the architecture of what was collapsing. The investigation, she said. Whitmore's committee formally resumed jurisdiction this morning. 2 of the colleagues who had been quietly blocking procedural progress withdrew their objections before 9 a.m., which is what happens when people in connected positions realize the ground has shifted under them. Rourke's voice had a dry, satisfied edge. The DOJ is opening a parallel investigation into the 6 remaining defense contracts that Arvast's structure was used to model. It's going to be a long process. It's going to produce results. Olivia's documentation, Maya said, is central to everything. Her attorney has been in conversation with the DOJ about her status as a cooperating witness and about protections commensurate with what she built and what was done to her because of it. He paused. She's going to be fine. That's not a legal opinion. It's the one I have anyway. Maya looked at the window. The tree outside it had lost most of its leaves in the storm and not gotten them back yet, and the branches were bare against the sky, which was the particular blue of a late October afternoon that had decided to be clear after days of not being. My record, she said. I was going to call you about that separately, Rourke said, but since we're here. She heard him shift, the sound of someone sitting forward. The 3 soldiers you saved submitted formal statements to the Army Review Board 6 days ago, independently, without coordination. Sergeant First Class Derek Ames, Specialist Carla Novak, and Private First Class James Okafor. Their accounts are consistent with each other and inconsistent with the documented version of events. He paused. The officer who filed the original report, Colonel Warren Steck, retired, was contacted by the board for comment. He declined to provide one, which the board noted in their preliminary findings. Preliminary findings, Maya said, issued this morning. Formal findings take 90 days. But the preliminary establishes that the original record contains significant discrepancies, that the disciplinary action was applied inconsistently with documented field conditions, and that additional review is warranted. His voice was careful and precise, the way he got when the thing he was saying mattered and he wanted to get it right. It's not a full reversal. Not yet. But it's the beginning of one. And the people making that determination have now seen your name in the context of Whitmore Ridge, and that context is, it's not irrelevant. Maya was quiet for a long moment. 3 years. The apartment and the rotating shifts and the blood pressure cuff and the chair that creaked and the careful absence of anything that looked like her real history. Because her real history was the thing that had been used against her. And the safest thing she knew how to do with something that had been used against her was to put it somewhere it couldn't be reached. She'd spent 3 years making herself smaller than she was, and the strange thing, the thing she was only now beginning to see clearly, was that the smallness had never actually protected her from anything. It had just made her invisible enough that when the moment came, the people who wanted to use her as a liability hadn't been prepared for what she actually was. "Thank you, Rourke," she said. "Don't thank me yet. 90 days. "I know. Thank you anyway." The press got the story on day 3, which was faster than Maya had expected and about as fast as she'd feared. The sequence that reached the public was incomplete and dramatized and had several details wrong, but the core of it, nurse saves senator's daughter, uncovers assassination plot, stops the man who was supposed to be the responding physician, was accurate enough to be recognizable and significant enough to move. She didn't watch the coverage. She'd made that decision on day 1, when the first notification appeared on her phone from a news aggregator app she hadn't opened in months, and she'd turned the notifications off and put the phone in a drawer and gone for a run in the cold morning air, along the river path she used when she needed to be moving without having to think about where she was going. The run helped. It didn't solve anything, but it helped. What she hadn't anticipated was her colleagues. She'd gone back to her regular rotation at Harlow Regional on day 4, because the alternative was sitting in her apartment while the world processed a story about her, which was an intolerable alternative. The shift supervisor, a small, precise woman named Donna, who managed a 14-person nursing staff with the combination of warmth and implacability that the job required, had met her at the staff entrance and said simply, "We're glad you're back. Station 4 needs a secondary check on the post-surgical in room 9. That was all. No speech, no ceremony, no particular acknowledgement of the fact that Maya had been on the national news the night before. It was the most respectful thing anyone had done for her in recent memory. The rest of the staff was less circumspect, which was fine. She'd expected it, and she understood it, and she answered the questions that were answerable and redirected the ones that weren't. By the second hour of the shift, it had mostly settled into the background, and she was doing her job, which was the whole point of coming in. It was during a medication check in room 12 late in the shift that one of the younger nurses, a 24-year-old named Priya, who had been on the floor for 8 months and who reminded Maya very slightly of herself at that age, in the particular way of someone who had decided to be competent and hadn't yet been told that competence wasn't sufficient protection against the other things, found her and stood in the doorway with the expression of someone who had been deciding whether to say something for a while. "Go ahead," Maya said, without turning around. "I wanted to ask you something, and if it's personal and you don't want to answer, I completely understand. I just ask. Were you scared at the gala when you were doing it?" Maya finished the medication check, noted it, and turned around. Priya was holding her tablet against her chest like a shield, which was an unconscious gesture that Maya recognized as the posture of someone who has committed to a vulnerable question and is waiting to find out whether that was wise. "Yes," Maya said, "I was scared. But you did it anyway." "I was scared because it mattered. The fear and the mattering are the same thing." She paused because she wanted to say this right, and not in the way that made it sound like a motivational poster. When you know what needs to happen, and you have the ability to make it happen, fear is just, it's information. It's telling you that the stakes are real. That's useful. The question is whether you use the information or let it make your decisions for you. Priya was quiet for a moment. Then, they tried to stop you. Yes. And you just didn't stop. Maya looked at her, at the earnest, slightly overwhelmed face of someone 8 months into a career that was going to be full of moments that required exactly this kind of decision. They had credentials, Maya said. I had what I'd seen and what I knew. Those aren't the same thing, and the second one doesn't automatically yield to the first. She picked up her tablet. That's the lesson, if there is one. Credentials tell you what someone was authorized to know. They don't tell you what someone actually knows. And they don't tell you what you actually know either. Know what you know. Trust it. Not in defiance of everything else. Listen, assess, be rigorous, but don't abandon it just because the room is full of people with more letters after their name. Priya nodded slowly. She held the thought for a moment, the way you hold something to check its weight. Okay, she said, and went back to work. Maya watched her go and thought about what it cost to learn that lesson versus what it cost not to. The formal public statement came from Senator Whitmore's office on day 9. She'd been given a draft to review 48 hours before, which she'd returned with 2 corrections, one factual, one tonal. Both had been incorporated. She appreciated that more than she'd expected to. The statement described the events at Whitmore Ridge accurately and attributed her role without embellishment, which was what she'd asked for. It also included, in the second-to-last paragraph, a formal request to the Army Review Board to expedite their findings, citing Maya's actions as a demonstration of the ongoing consequences of unjust disciplinary records. What it meant for someone to be made smaller by an institution in order to protect a decision, and what the cost of that smallness could have been. The night in Charleston when the outcome had depended entirely on what she'd been able to survive not having. The paragraph had not been in the draft she'd reviewed. She read it in her apartment the morning it went public, at the kitchen table in the same light, and she read it twice, and then she set her phone face down on the table and sat with it. Outside, the bare tree had a pair of birds on its highest branch that hadn't been there before. Small ones, gray, doing what birds did, existing in a place and not making any particular argument about it. She thought about Derek Ames, Carla Novak, James Okafor. 3 names she'd carried for 3 years in the specific way you carried things you couldn't talk about. Not at the surface, not accessible in ordinary conversation, but present the way permanent things were present underneath. They'd submitted statements, independently, without coordination. She'd never asked them to do that. She hadn't been in contact with any of them since the proceedings. They'd done it because something in them had decided it needed doing, and they'd waited 3 years for a moment when doing it might mean something. She thought about what it meant to be loyal to someone you couldn't publicly acknowledge being loyal to. She thought about how long they'd been carrying it too. Her phone screen lit up on the table even face down, the notification visible as a stripe of white light. She turned it over. It was a number she didn't recognize. South Carolina area code, different exchange from Rourke's. She answered. Is this Maya Reeves? A voice she didn't know. Male, mid-30s, something careful in the diction. Yes. This is Derek Ames. A pause. Sergeant First Class, retired. Another pause. I don't know if you... I wasn't sure if you'd know who I was. I know who you are, Maya said. She heard him exhale on the other end. The sound of relief so long deferred that it came out like something physical being set down. I've wanted to call for 3 years, he said. We all have. Novak found your nursing license in a public database about 18 months ago, which is how we knew where you'd... He stopped, started again. We submitted the statements because it was the right thing and because we should have found a way to do it sooner and because what they did to you was... He stopped again. I wanted to say I'm sorry that it took this long. You don't owe me an apology, Maya said. I know you'd say that. I'm saying it because it's true. Then I'm saying it anyway, Ames said, because I need to. She let him. What you did that night, he said. The extraction. You made a decision in about 30 seconds that the rest of us were still processing. And afterward, during the proceedings, you never said a word that would have... He broke off. You could have defended yourself by describing the situation in a way that would have implicated the people in the chain of command who made it possible. You didn't. It wouldn't have worked, Maya said, and it would have made it harder for the investigation to remain on the decision-making level where it needed to be. I know, Ames said. That's tactical thinking. I know what it is. I'm just saying most people don't do it. Most people, when they're being buried, reach for whatever they can reach for. I reached for the right thing. It just didn't connect. Until now, he said. Until now. The words settled somewhere they fit. How are you? Maya asked. It was a simple question. She meant it. Better, Ames said. I've been better for a while. Novak's a physician assistant in Georgia now. Okafor re-enlisted. He's a staff sergeant. Both of them asked me to tell you. He paused. Both of them asked me to tell you that they're thinking about you, and that they always did, and that they wanted you to know. Maya put her free hand flat on the kitchen table. Tell them thank you, she said. I will. They talked for another few minutes, not about the events or the record or the proceedings, but about other things. Where he was living, the work he'd moved into, the kind of ordinary life update you exchanged with someone you'd been through something real with when the gap finally closed. It wasn't effortless. 3 years of silence left texture, things that required navigation, but it was real. And it moved the way real things moved. When she ended the call, she sat at the table for a while in the quiet. The Army Review Board issued its formal findings 61 days after the preliminary, 29 days ahead of schedule, which was not standard and which she understood to be the product of several things converging, including the public record established by Whitmore Ridge and the quality of the testimony submitted. The findings reversed the disciplinary action in full. The language cited procedural irregularities in the original review, testimony inconsistent with documented field conditions, and evidence of institutional pressure on the reporting process. It was not by any measure an apology. It was the careful language of an institution correcting a record without framing the correction as an admission of wrongdoing. She'd expected that. She accepted it. Her nursing license, which had never been revoked, was now accompanied by a cleared service record. Her military decorations, the ones that had been quietly removed from accessible documentation, were restored to the official record. The citation that had been written for the extraction and suppressed before it could be formally submitted was entered retroactively. Rourke called when the findings went public. How are you? Working through it, she said. That's an honest answer. I'm trying to be honest lately. Getting better at it, he said, which was a joke. And she recognized it as such, which meant something about how far the dynamic between them had traveled from the night he'd called an unknown number in a ballroom during a rainstorm. Prine, she said. Update? Arraigned last week, entered a not guilty plea that his attorney knows is a placeholder while they assess what a trial actually looks like given the documentation. The DOJ is not interested in a plea that reduces the charge below conspiracy. We'll see where it goes. He paused. Hart will testify. That's confirmed. A former deputy undersecretary testifying against a current sitting senator. It's going to be a very public proceeding. Good, Maya said. Yes, Rourke agreed. It is. Briggs's trial date was set for March. The charges were federal and the documentation was extensive, and his attorney had not, as of the call, filed any motions that suggested a realistic defense strategy, which Rourke characterized as the behavior of an attorney preparing for a mitigation argument rather than an acquittal attempt. Sims had completed his cooperation agreement. Vail had entered a guilty plea on the fraud charges and was awaiting sentencing on the conspiracy charge. Selle was cooperating fully, which his attorney had correctly identified as his only viable option. The network that had been built over 6 years, layered through holding companies and contracts and the quiet application of political access, was being taken apart one piece at a time. It was slow. It was institutional. It was not dramatic in the way the night at the gala had been dramatic, but it was the kind of work that produced results that lasted, and Maya had enough experience with both kinds of outcomes to know which one she preferred. Senator Whitmore asked to meet with her in person 3 weeks after the review board findings. They met at his Columbia office, which was less formal than she'd expected. A working space rather than a ceremonial one, papers on the desk, a credenza stacked with binders, a window that looked out on a courtyard where someone had planted something that wasn't doing well this late in the year. He offered her coffee, which she took, and they sat across from each other in the way of two people who had been through something together, and were only now, in the quiet and the ordinary daylight, getting to meet each other as people. "Olivia is back at work," he said. "I know. She texted me last week." That surprised him slightly. The fact of the text. The fact that they'd developed a line of communication independent of him. He absorbed it with the grace of a man who had learned that the people around him were not extensions of his own narrative. "She's finishing the supplemental documentation," he said. "Additional materials for the DOJ. She says she wants it completed before the trial because she wants the record to be as complete as possible regardless of how the proceedings go." "That sounds like her," Maya said. "Yes." He smiled, and it was a smile that carried more weight than most. "She's not easy to move once she's decided something." "No?" Maya said. "She's not." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I've been trying to figure out how to say what I want to say, which is unusual for me. I make statements for a living." "Take your time." "What I want to say," Whitmore said, "is that the system failed you. Not in a systemic critique way, as a statement about institutions in the abstract, in the specific, documented, named individuals way. Someone in your chain of command used the institutional process to protect himself, and it cost you 3 years and a record, and your ability to work in the field you were trained for." He looked at her directly. "That's not a tragedy that happened. That's a wrong that was done, and the fact that it's now corrected on paper doesn't undo what it cost." Maya looked at her coffee. "No," she said, "it doesn't. I can't give you those 3 years back. I can tell you that your name is clear and that the people who will know why it is will understand what it means. And I can offer you something." He leaned forward slightly. "We're establishing a rapid response medical coordination unit, emergency field medicine working in conjunction with federal operations, situations where standard medical response isn't adequate or isn't available quickly enough. It's the kind of work that requires someone who understands field conditions, who can make the kind of decisions that can't wait for institutional authorization, and who has the background to do it without," he paused, "without getting someone killed." Maya looked at him. "It's not military, and it's not hospital work," he said. "It's something in between, with the authority to operate in that space. We're building the framework now. It doesn't exist yet in the form it will exist." He met her eyes. "I want you to help build it." She sat with it. She sat with it the way she'd sat with things for 3 years, quietly, without rushing the process, letting it be what it was before she decided what to do with it. The 3 years. The apartment and the rotating shifts and the careful invisibility and the things she'd put away because there was no safe place to put it. The night in the ballroom with the blood pressure cuff and the chair that creaked and the champagne glass ringing on the marble column and the decision to move before she'd consciously made it. The truth was that she'd never stopped being what she was. She'd just stopped operating in a context that could use it. She'd made herself small in a space that demanded smallness. And what had happened in Charleston was what happened when the moment arrived anyway. When the situation didn't accommodate the smallness and the things she'd been sitting on top of for 3 years came through anyway. Whether or not it was convenient, whether or not the room was ready for it. You could bury a record. You couldn't bury what a person knew or what they were capable of when the stakes were real. She'd learned that. She'd known it, actually, for a long time. She just needed the specific proof. "Yes," she said. Whitmore nodded, not with triumph, with something quieter and more appropriate. "There's one condition," she said. "Name it." "The framework needs to have real authority, not advisory, not consultative. If we're in the field and a decision needs to be made, the person with the field expertise makes it. Not the most credentialed person in a room somewhere who hasn't seen what we're seeing." She kept her voice level. "I won't spend 3 years building something that reproduces the structure that put me in a ballroom as a liability instead of an asset." He didn't flinch from it. "Agreed," he said. "That's how it has to work for it to be worth building." She extended her hand across the desk. He took it. Thumb. She drove back to Harlow through the flat South Carolina landscape, the fields and the water towers and the rural miles between cities, with the radio off and the heater on and the late afternoon coming through the windshield in the long, level way of winter light that didn't apologize for what it illuminated. She thought about Priya in the doorway of room 12, holding the tablet against her chest and asking whether she'd been scared. The fear and the mattering are the same thing. She'd said it because it was true, and she'd believed it for a long time. Not as a comfort, but as a fact, the way you believed things that had been earned through enough situations where the alternative to believing them was stopping. But there was another half to it that she hadn't said, because Priya was 8 months into her career and wasn't ready for it yet, and because some things needed to be arrived at rather than delivered. The other half was this: it got easier. Not to be afraid. That didn't go away, and you shouldn't want it to, because Rourke was right that the absence of it was its own kind of danger. But it got easier to act inside the fear, to know it was there and keep moving anyway, not because of bravado or because you'd convinced yourself the stakes weren't real, but because you'd been in enough situations where acting was the only viable response and you'd survived them, and the survival was evidence that the capacity was real. That took time. It took the specific, unrepeatable experience of being in a situation where you had to find out what you were made of and finding out that it was sufficient. Not perfect, not clean, but sufficient. You had to have the situations to build the evidence, and you had to survive the situations to use the evidence. And some of the situations were not things you would have chosen, and some of the things that built you were things that were done to you without your consent by people who intended the opposite of building. That was the part that had taken her 3 years to fully understand, sitting in the apartment and the rotating shifts and the invisibility. The thing that had broken something hadn't only broken something, it had also, in the breaking, confirmed what it had tried to break, because she'd still been standing at the end of it, and the standing was information. You could disagree with the institution that had tried to diminish you. You could know that what they'd done was wrong and unfair and motivated by self-protection rather than any genuine assessment of your value. You could carry the record and the silence and the years of careful smallness and still know, underneath all of that, in the place where you kept things that were yours regardless of what anyone put in the official files, that you knew what you knew, and that knowing was not subject to review. She crossed the bridge into Harlow as the last of the daylight left the sky, the city lights coming up on both sides of the river, the familiar streets starting. She rolled down the window for a block, even though it was cold, just to feel the air. Then she rolled it back up, turned onto her street, and went home. The water stain on the ceiling was still there. She was going to call the building manager tomorrow. Tonight, she put water on for tea and sat at the kitchen table in the window light and thought about the work ahead. Not with dread, and not with the particular exhaustion of someone who had been pretending to be less than they were for long enough that the pretending had started to feel permanent. She thought about it the way you think about something you're ready for. The cases that didn't have protocol for them. The situations that required someone who could make the call when the call needed to be made, not when the institution had finished deliberating. The people who were going to be in rooms where no one with the right knowledge was supposed to be present, and how the difference between those people surviving and not surviving was often just that. Someone present who knew what to do and chose to do it regardless of what the room thought about their credentials. She'd been that person in a ballroom in Charleston when no one in the room expected it, and the architecture of the night had been designed to make sure she failed. She'd been that person before that, in conditions that made Charleston look like a controlled setting, and she was still here. That was not a small thing. She'd spent 3 years treating it like a small thing, like a piece of information about herself that needed to be kept at low volume. She was done treating it that way. The water boiled. She made the tea. She sat in her kitchen in the ordinary evening of an ordinary city and let herself be, without apology and without qualification, exactly what she was. A woman who had been underestimated, dismissed, discarded, and deployed as a liability, and who had, in the specific moment that required everything she had, been none of those things. What she had been, in that moment, and in all the moments before it that had built toward it without her knowing, was ready. She had always been ready. The world had just needed a moment bad enough to prove it.